Well, hello, everybody. Pastor Steve here, and thank you for joining me for today's devotion. We are in Genesis chapter 10, and I know when we come to these chapters that are filled with genealogy, you all get really excited. I understand they're not the most, they're not the most exciting to read, but and I feel the same way. But having said that, they are important because they help us understand the history of God's people and how God worked in history through various people groups. They also remind us that we all have a common ancestor. And we are all created in the image of God. Even genetics and stuff is pointing to the commonality of the origin of human beings on planet Earth. So they're good reminders of that. And I want you to look at verse 6. Verse 6. The sons of Ham were Cush and Mizraim and Put and Canaan. Now, Ham is Noah's son who disrespected him in chapter 9 we talked about yesterday, who went in and looked on and laughed at his nakedness, if you will. And he has these sons. And Canaan is the one, Canaan is mentioned here, the last of the sons in verse 6. Canaan is the one that had the curse put on him because of Ham's sin, his father's sin, that he would be subservient to the descendants of Ham's brothers. And that his descendants are Canaan's descendants are the ones who settled the promised land, the Canaanites, that the descendants of Shem, in particular, displaced when they conquered and settled in the promised land. When the Jewish people conquered it. Verse 22, the sons of Shem were Elam and Asher, and then that word, you got Lud or Lud and Aram, but you have Arpachshad. And Arpachshad, his genealogy is described in more detail in the next chapter, in chapter 11. But Arpachshad, through his descendants and the descendants of Shem, so Shem and then Arpachshad, his son, and then right on down in the next chapter, you'll see that through him came Abram, or we later knew him as Abraham, the Jewish people, and the Messiah. The Messiah. So the Messiah, Jesus, was a descendant through Noah's son, Shem. Now back to verse 6, the sons of Ham were Cush. As you read this chapter, the descendants of Cush spread out in multiple directions. In verse 8, we have Nimrod. Verse 8, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. So Cush's sons go different directions, and you're going to see that here. Nimrod, one of Cush's sons. So this is the grandson of Ham, the great-grandson of Noah. Nimrod became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter in verse 9 before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and these other places in the land of Shinar, which is mentioned elsewhere in the Bible and was a way of referring to southern Mesopotamia, or what would become Babylon. When it talks about him being a mighty hunter, it wasn't that he was good at, hunting animals. He was a warrior. He was a warrior, and he became known as a strong warrior. And the beginning of his kingdom, he and his descendants were the beginning of the development of the kingdom that was in Shinar. When you read the Old Testament, so the Israel was often impacted by the kingdoms in the region of Babylon, the actual empire of Babylon, which would be in, say, modern Iraq, the empire of Assyria, which would be northern Iraq and up into Syria and so on today, the empire of Persia, which would be to the east of that a little bit, and what today we would think of more as of Iran and some areas kind of north and east of that. And the beginning of those regions being a powerful empire are right here in these verses we just read with Nimrod. Now, Nimrod's brother, um, or Cush's brother, rather, Mizraim, he settled in Egypt, and Put, in verse 6, in Libya, northern Africa, if you will, and the area west of Egypt, and then Canaan, the promised land. So when I said Ham's descendants spread out, and that Cush's descendants in particular spread out a lot of different directions, that's true. And so, and I don't know if you get anything devotionally out of this, but it points to, okay, God gave the promised land to the Jewish people, the descendants of Shem, and the Canaanites, who were descendants of Ham through Canaan, were displaced by the Israelites. But it's also true that the descendants of Ham, who settled over in Babylon and were the ones who eventually became those different empires, every time Israel sinned, God raised up as an empire the descendants of Ham to come in and discipline them. So in one sense, the people who were descendants of Ham, the one who sinned, were subservient to Israel. Israel got the promised land, but when Israel sinned, God used those other descendants to discipline right on down through history. And so when you're reading about all of that in the books of Kings and in Isaiah and Jeremiah, this is the origins of all of it. And the point I want to make is that God has a plan through human history, even when we don't see it. And we need to remember that. And that God sometimes uses those who have a heritage of evil to discipline those who are His when they are not being faithful to Him. And that for me is some of the lessons from this chapter. Look forward to being with you tomorrow, a little more genealogy, but also some really, really good stuff in chapter 11. God bless you, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow.